Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and I'm back with another video talking about decks here. So, today we're going to be talking about Jeskai Dragons for the Oath of the Gatewatch season as standard. We are about a month or so away from Shadows over Innistrad here, and I just recently had a regional Pro Tour qualifier here at the end of February. So I ended up going 5-1 and then intentionally drew into top 8 of the regional Pro Tour qualifier for Madrid. And in round 1 of top 8, I unfortunately lost. So it kind of sucks that I got so close to being in the Pro Tour. However, we did come very, very close to it with a deck that is a little bit more out of the ordinary now than it was before. So we are going to go through this deck here, and I'm going to show you the changes that I would make after playing 6 rounds here, technically, or I guess 7 rounds, including top 8 of standard, not including the intentional draw that I had at the final round, round 7 of the event. But we are going to go through this deck. I'll show you the stuff that I would change, and we'll talk a little bit more here about sideboarding in terms of why each card is here in the sideboard and what cards I would swap for given matchups. So, starting off, just to talk about the cards, we're playing 2 Dispel on the main board. Dispel's really good right now. It deals with a lot of problematic cards. Crackling Dooms, Abzan Charms if your opponent's playing them, Murderous Cuts, but especially Rally the Ancestors and Collected Company are 2 huge cards in the format right now, so you want to be able to deal with those cards, and Dispel is pretty good at it. Main board, it is a perfect card to have. We have 1 more in the sideboard here as well to be able to sideboard in. We're also playing 3 Jace, Vryn's Prodigy. So the Jace is really awesome at being able to recur removal for you. That's kind of like the biggest reason why you actually have the Jace in here. The looting on Jace is also kind of important in getting you into better cards in the early game. He kind of baits removal most of the time as well, which allows you to grind out your opponents within the first couple of turns. It lets you maybe have a Mantis Rider that survives that you can ride out for like 6 or 9 points of damage if your opponent doesn't find removal, and eventually does. But the Jace is really awesome because it allows you to play back like Draconic Roars and Roasts very easily. Even the occasional Dig Through Time as well, which is awesome. So the Jace is awesome for that, especially if you flip him, then you're able to devalue your opponent's creatures as well. We're playing 4 Silumgar Scorn, so this is like the reason to play the Dragons deck, because with your Thunderbreak Regents and your Dragonlord Ojutais, as well as the 1 Dragonlord Silumgar that we have in the sideboard here as well, the Silumgar Scorn is basically just counterspell for us. Excuse me. So the Silumgar Scorn is awesome just because it's going to counter anything for us just permanently. The only like downside of this card is if you play against the Eldrazi matchup, they still get their triggers off of like Ulamog or Worldbreaker, but that's not all that amazing. Like, if they're not getting their creature, that's not really that important. Silumgar Scorn just basically counters anything that we don't really have a way to deal with otherwise, and it can get like a Kalidas or a Siege Reno off of our opponent's board from actually hitting if we don't want them to have that creature, or otherwise like Goblin Dark Dwellers. There are a lot of really good value cards that you don't want your opponent to be able to stick, especially like Planeswalkers, because we don't really have like a enormous amount of ways to deal with Planeswalkers. Like, we can hit it with a Mantis Rider, or if our opponent targets our Thunderbreak Regent, we can redirect the damage to the Planeswalker, but that's not all that amazing. Same thing with like Jeskai Charm. We can deal the 4 damage and point it at our opponent, and then redirect that damage to their Planeswalker. But the Scorn's pretty good at dealing with problematic things that we don't really want our opponent to be able to resolve. We have the 4 Dig Through Time just because we're going to be filling up our graveyard. We're kind of planning for the late game if we don't just smash our opponent with Mantis Rider and Thunderbreak Regent. Also the Dragonlord Ojutai, but that takes like turn 5, turn 6 before you're actually going to play that card. So the Dig Through Time is really just going to help us in the late game. In some of the matchups, I shave down the numbers, like in the super aggressive matchups where we want more removal, I'll shave down the Dig Through Times to like 2 copies, sometimes maybe shave off 1 copy if I'm trying to jam other cards, but usually this card's like is just going to be your 4 of in any matchup that you expect to just be playing for a long period of time. We have 2 Fiery Impulses for like the more aggressive decks in the format. Like any of the decks where we would expect our opponent to be playing a bunch of small value creatures that they're just trying to smash us with very early, the Impulse is great for that. Otherwise, if you're playing against like the Anafenza Rhino decks, then the Fiery Impulse is just going to side out. Like, it's not valuable for us, and we would be much better off with like a Valorous Stance or like another Roast or anything like that. We have 4 Draconic Roars, so this is like by far the most impressive card in this deck, and is like the reason to play it outside of Silumgar Scorn. Draconic Roar is amazing just because being able to get rid of like Sylvan Advocates, Deathmist Raptors, cards like that are very good and valuable in the format, that is just amazing. And you also get the benefit of dealing damage to your opponent if you have a dragon on the field or if you reveal one. So this will help us shave off a few points of our opponent's life while also getting rid of their creatures. You can also get rid of smaller things like Reflector Mages or things of that nature, but the Draconic Roar is great for the removal just because it deals the 3 damage and it gets around a lot of the 3-butt creatures that your opponents may have on the table, and that's increasingly more popular nowadays. Like, creatures have 2 toughness instead of, or 3 toughness, excuse me, instead of 2 toughness, more likely in the format right now. So the Draconic Roar gets around a lot of creatures. So that's one of the big reasons to actually play this deck, is being able to play Draconic Roar. We have a Singleton Roast. I like Roast. It's just kind of versatile removal for a lot of different things. Roast has the downside of not being able to hit creatures with flying, and otherwise, if we were playing any of the matchups where we're playing against like Rhinos or Anafenzas or Cletus or anything like that, we can sideboard in another Roast and just have some more removal. It really just came down to only being able to fit in 1 Roast in this deck because I wanted to be a little bit more greedy and play 2 Dispels, and I still stand by that decision even after like playing so many rounds. Like, 1 Roast is probably the safe number in the main board to have in terms of the things that we could potentially face up against. We have 4 Thunderbreak Regents, so this is just like the value creature that you're grinding out your opponent with. If they target it, it's going to deal 3 damage to that player. We can redirect that damage to Planeswalkers if we need to. Usually that's not the case. We're just going to be pointing it at our opponent, and we're just going to try and smash them. The Thunderbreak is great if you have it in multiples, especially if you have a Dragonlord Ojutai out and they're trying to kill that. Then they're going to be suffering multiple triggers of the Thunderbreak Regent itself. So that is great for the upside that it has in that. But otherwise, just value creature, value beater, has flying, the evasion's always awesome. We have the Ojutai, which is just like the powerhouse dragon that we're playing in here. If it connects and deals damage to our opponent, we are able to look at the top 3 cards of our library, pick one of them, put it into our hand, the rest go to the bottom. So it could mean getting like another Silumgar Scorn, which was the case in a lot of my matchups, or like you find another Draconic Roar, Jeskai Charm. You just find value cards off the top, or even just dig yourself a little bit deeper into the cards that you actually need. But the Dragonlord Ojutai is just supreme as far as having hexproof while it's untapped. That's just awesome, because if they don't get rid of it with like a Crackling Doom or something like that, which if you see your opponents playing the colors for Crackling Doom, you're likely going to keep a Silumgar Scorn or a Dispel up to be able to protect your creature, but that just takes a little bit more like experience and know-how with playing these types of decks, where you don't really just blindly throw a Dragonlord Ojutai into a deck that could potentially be playing Crackling Doom and allow your opponent to play Crackling Doom for 3 mana and just get rid of your Ojutai for free, when you could be playing a little bit more cautiously and keep a Scorn or a Dispel up. So the Ojutai is just like one of the best beaters that you have in this deck, but the downside is it's 5 mana and it's going to take a little bit of time to actually get it onto the battlefield, especially if you're trying to protect it. We have 4 Jeskai Charms, so this card was a lot more impressive than I thought it was going to be. So in a format that is playing a lot of fetch lands, and by a lot of fetch lands, I mean like 12 or 15 in the case of Rally, if they're playing a lot of fetch lands in their deck, you get the benefit of being able to put target creature on top of its owner's library, and doing this in response to your opponent using a fetch land is really where you're just getting value, because you put it on top of their deck and then they're forced to search their deck for something. Even if they fail to find it, doesn't matter. They're still going to be searching their deck and they're still going to be forced to shuffle it. So you can put something on top of their deck, they shuffle it, find their land or whatever. Just being able to get rid of it permanently because they fetched their land is just insane. But otherwise, dealing the 4 damage is awesome, just because you can burn your opponent and then flash it back with Jace, and you're able to just deal a whole lot of damage with the spells that you're using in your arsenal. But also, just getting the +1/+1 and lifelink on your dudes is also awesome, because if you're playing against like a aggressive Atarka red or something like that, like having a Mantis Rider and a Thunderbreak doesn't really punish you for committing your turns to playing creatures, because then you're able to give them +1/+1 and lifelink, which unwinds the damage that your opponent's dealing, assuming they don't have a command that they're going to use to restrict you from gaining the life. The Jeskai Charm is awesome. The only thing I wish about this card is like if you could point the damage at a creature as well, like Mardu Charm is able to do. But that's like asking too much. This card's already really, really good. And one thing to keep in mind, and I think like a lot of people do forget that, was what I explained, like putting a creature on top of your owner's library and then having them shuffle for some effect. That's really what like the supreme mode that I used for the Jeskai Charm across the event for all my rounds. That was like the most important thing. And then we have like the Mantis Rider, which is just value beater, doesn't get hit by roast, which is like the biggest upside to this card. And having Vigilance assures it as a blocker for the following turns, where you can block smaller creatures that your opponent's attacking with, or force them, in the case of like the Tarka Red matchup, to use like Titan Strengths or things of that nature to actually be able to trade with the Mantis Rider, or otherwise just kill it. You're forcing your opponent to use their resources, which is awesome because chances are you're probably going to have removal like Draconic Roar or like a Roast or something like that in the following turn to just kind of 1-for-1 with them, where they probably use like 1 or 2 spells to actually be able to get over your creature in the first place. Otherwise, the land base, there's not really much to talk about. Like, we're playing 12 fetch lands, so we have the Bloodstained Mires, we have the Flooded Strands, and we have the Polluted Deltas. Those are going to fetch us Prairie Stream, Smoldering Marsh, or Sunken Hollow. The numbers are 2, 1, and 1 for these guys. We're also playing like 4 Mystic Monasteries, so these ones you want to play earlier in your turns in sequence, and so you can either hit like a Jace on turn 2 or the Mantis Rider on turn 3. That's much more important. Like, you want to be able to hit your Mantis Rider on turn 3. Having double blue in this deck is also important, and when you're fetching, having multiple sources of blue is important just so you can hit Dig Through Time and also be able to do something like Jeskai Charm for the turn, or even like Dig Through Time and Silumgar Scorn if you find it off the top. So it requires a little bit of thinking in terms of what you're planning for to be able to do after you Dig Through Time, especially if you're only casting it for blue, and Delve Away 6. So sequencing how you tap your mana and how you fetch for it is kind of important, and that's what kind of like takes away like the more you play this deck, you'll realize what colors you actually need and on what turn, but being able to play a Mantis Rider on turn 3, Jace on turn 2 if you have it in hand is pretty important, but ultimately finding more sources of blue to play that Dig Through Time is just key, and like double red for Thunderbreak Regent. Those are like the only real things that you should like actually care about, like out of all of this, is like double red for Thunderbreak, turn 2 Jace, turn 3 Mantis Rider, and a lot of blue for Dig Through Time plays. But the Silumgar Scorn in the early game is much less important than it is on like turn 4 and onwards. Like that's when like your opponent's actual value cards start to hit the table. Like I guess even turn 3, like turn 3 onwards, like Silumgar Scorn gets much better. Like at turn 2, Silumgar Scorn is not all that impressive, but anywhere later on it becomes much better. Otherwise, like we're playing 2 Wandering Fumarole. I didn't activate it all that much, but sometimes you get those instances where you can block stuff or you can just push damage with the Fumarole itself. So now to talk about the sideboard. So for the sideboard here, first and foremost, we have the Soulfire Grandmaster. So I was actually not able to sideboard this card as much for this event as I thought I was actually going to, just mainly because I didn't really actually play against any like Atarka Red or like super aggressive decks like Prowess or anything like that. However, that was the intent of the Soulfire Grandmaster, to actually sideboard this card in over some Jaces. I actually don't really like Jace that much, like on turn 2 against the like Atarka Red or Prowess decks, and even less with like if I draw it like later on. Whereas with like Soulfire Grandmaster and like a Fiery Impulse or like a Draconic Roar or something like that, even like a Roast or like the Kozilek's Return that we have especially, being able to gain some life off of our instants and sorceries, having lifelink is insane, and I definitely like it more than the Jace, so I tend to sideboard those in over the Jace itself. However, like I really don't like this card in the main board just because it kind of sucks whenever you draw it against like the super mid-range or control decks. If you're going into like way late game, like yeah, it's cool to pay 4 mana to be able to get something back like a Draconic Roar, Roast, or like a Jeskai Charm, and to be able to use it over and over again, but the times that actually happens are very far and few. So what usually ends up happening is that I like to have this card in the sideboard just for the more aggressive matchups where I'm actually gaining life off of the instants and sorceries that I'm casting, or at least that's the plan. And usually for like the most aggressive matchups, the Soulfire Grandmaster is awesome for that. I have 2 Valorous Stance, so the Valorous Stance is going to sideboard in over like the Fiery Impulse for the matchups where your opponent's playing things like Anafenza and like Siege Rhino. Those are like the big heavy hits that you want to be getting rid of with a Valorous Stance. The same thing goes with like cards like Wingmate Rock. So if your opponent's playing something like Bant Company with the Wingmate Rocks, then like the Valorous Stance is pretty good at doing that. Some of the decks are also playing Nissa, so if they're able to play the Planeswalker Nissa, make their guys a little bit bigger, you can get rid of like Deathmas Raptors and whatnot. But the stance is usually pretty good at being able to get rid of like the more awkward creatures that like your Draconic Roar and your Fiery Impulse can't hit. And it's pretty easy to pinpoint which decks you actually want the Valorous Stance for, and which matchups it's pretty useful in. It's also good at like dealing with Goblin Dark Dwellers, and especially for giving your creature indestructible. It gets around like Murderous Cuts that your opponent might be playing. Like, it unfortunately doesn't do anything to Crackling Doom, because Crackling Doom makes you sacrifice, but the stance is actually pretty good at doing a whole lot whenever it comes to the value removal that's within the format. We're playing another Dispel, which I was actually a little bit more displeased with the Dispel than I thought I was going to be. The only time that I actually sideboarded in another Dispel was against a mirror match where my opponent was playing Jeskai Black with Goblin Dark Dwellers. That's the only time that I sideboarded in the additional Dispel, just because I couldn't really find enough places to cut cards to be able to play another Dispel, even in like the company matchup. So the Dispel was a little bit more underwhelming, but just for the sake and purpose of having it in the sideboard, the Dispel was mainly for being able to counteract cards like Crackling Doom and things of that nature, just so that your opponent's not able to cast them and get rid of your good valuable creatures. There's also, like I mentioned with talking about the Dispel in general, like there's so much good instant speed stuff in the format that like the Dispel is good enough to play in the main board, but having a third one was definitely unnecessary, and I'll talk about the changes that I would make to the sideboard after we actually get through it. The Disdainful Stroke was amazing. This card sideboarded in like a whole lot for me. Again, it's like whenever you're cutting like the Fiery Impulses and like the Draconic Roars because they're not as potent for you, like your chances are you're setting in the Disdainful Strokes. It's good against like the Siege Rhino decks, anything that's playing like Goblin Dark Dwellers, the Company decks as well, because they're likely playing Wingmate Rock and the Collected Company itself. It can counter a Planeswalker in the case of playing against like Mardu or Black-White Control, especially if your opponent's hitting like a Secure the Wastes for a high value. You're able to use the Disdainful Stroke to get rid of the Secure the Wastes, Sorens, Obnixilis, Chandras, any of those decks that are curving out like very high and are playing high CMC cards, you want the Disdainful Stroke in for. We have two Painful Truths, which you want to have these for any of the matchups where your opponent's playing Duress or Transgress the Mind, any of those style of take a look at your hand and take something from it decks, as well as any deck where you think you're just going to go into the very late game and it's going to be a battle of attrition. Being able to pay 3 life and 3 mana and draw 3 cards is insane, especially if you're trying to outvalue your opponent for 1-for-1 exchanges. So the Painful Truths is pretty important to have if you're just planning on going to the late game and grinding out your opponent very slowly or with a moderate slow pace. We have another Roast, so again for the matchups where you want your removal to be a little bit bigger for 1-for-1 exchanges. 3 Kozilek's Return to be able to wipe out your opponent's board, especially good for the Secure the Waste decks just because you're able to do it at an instant speed, or if they commit for their turn to like use a Sorin and uptick and then attack with their creatures, or even like Ultimate a Gideon to make their creatures bigger and then have an uptick on Sorin. The Return is really good at just dealing with everything they have on board, and we're able to keep like our Mantis Rider and our Ojutais and our Thunderbreak Regents if we have them on the battlefield. So it doesn't really punish us for the creatures that we play, and it can get rid of a bunch of value stuff that our opponent might have on their field. And it's also especially good at dealing with the blue Eldrazi deck, which if you're familiar with it, it plays like Eldrazi Sky Spawners and things of that nature, like Eldrazi Mimics and whatnot, and it plays the land that you can crack and make 1/1 creatures off of it. So the Kozilek's Return is pretty good at dealing with that at an instant speed, and I actually got to use it against that matchup very effectively. So the Return, you just want to have it as a nice board wipe. Like, there's no real upside to this card with like the whole Eldrazi clause of like casting it back from your graveyard. This is just because it's instant speed and you can respond to your opponent doing things like Secure the Waste and whatnot, whereas with a Radiant Flames we wouldn't be able to deal with a board state where our opponent would make like, I don't know, like 7 1/1 tokens and then like play a Gideon and make them 2/2s and attack us with them for the turn. So the return's really good at just allowing us to deal with some stuff like that. We have 1 Chandra Flamecaller, so this card was amazing because this card alone won me a lot of games, and just being able to wipe the board of like creatures that are like X3s, especially in the case of like the company deck, getting rid of like all of their X3s or getting to wipe their board, including their Wingmate Rocks if they haven't made them bigger, just by playing the Chandra itself. Like a 6-mana Wrath is not bad whenever you're able to like actually get rid of everything your opponent has and everything they committed to the board. But otherwise, like making the 3/1 creatures with the +1 is awesome. I didn't really ever use the 0 ability on it. Basically, every single time I saw this card, it was like -3 to get rid of the board and then attack with like a Thunderbreak or an Ojutai. But the +1 and the -X are the modes you're going to be using the most on this card, and using it as a sweeper is just one of the most versatile things to actually have this card in the sideboard for. And last but not least, we have the Dragonlord Silumgar. So again, for the more grindy matchups, like anywhere where you see yourself going super long against any of the mid-range or like control matchups, the Silumgar is amazing. Being able to take a value creature like a Siege Rhino away from your opponent, or like even a Planeswalker that's close to ultimating, is just insane, and you just give yourself a great board advantage. But otherwise, it also adds towards the Silumgar's Scorns and the Draconic Roars that we are playing as well, so it gives us another target and a higher percentage of like actually having a dragon in our hand or on the battlefield that will actually cause these cards to work for us. Or not the Jace, the Silumgar Scorn, there we go. So being able to have our Draconic Roars and Silumgar Scorns be a little bit more efficient in hitting their second mode is really amazing, and just being able to have the Silumgar to add towards that is just kind of some extra fluff on the side. This card's just insane. Like, this was really, really awesome in a lot of different matchups that were more slow and grindy, and I really like it as a one-up. I wouldn't go up in any number of the Silumgars, or if at best, like, I might play another Chandra in the sideboard, but the Silumgar is definitely like a one-of, and is perfect as a one-up in the sideboard. So now, having said all of that, and having gone through the deck, here are the changes that I would actually make to it. So I made a separate deck here to actually go through the cards that we changed, and it was actually like very insignificant for the amount of cards we were changing. So the changes that I would make from the deck going onwards from here would be to play End Hostilities in here. So this deck can't really support Languish off of the mana that we have here, and Crux of Fates as well, so we want to be able to play End Hostilities and be able to get rid of all creatures, including land creatures if our opponent's using like Ruinous Path or anything like that to animate their creatures, their lands into creatures, rather. So the End Hostilities just wipes out everything on the field and all permanents attached to those creatures, which isn't relevant anymore. But having a board wipe for 5 mana, it doesn't really matter that it's 5 mana. Being able to wipe out a board that has like Wingmate Rocks and stuff in it is just insane, and like that was probably one of the most necessary things that I think I would have liked to have had in a lot of different instances, and it would have allowed me to get rid of a lot of awkward situations that I dug myself into based on tapping out for turns and whatnot. The End Hostilities, I think, is super necessary in the sideboard, especially just for a Wingmate Rock. And the way that we cut down to be able to actually get them was taking out one of the Dispels out of the sideboard that I mentioned was not all that necessary. Like, 2 Dispels is just fine in this deck, and cutting down on one of the Kozilek's returns, I think that 3 was way too many. 2 is just fine, and 2 is probably the amount that you can cut down on necessary cards for to be able to play the Kozilek's returns in the matchups that we mentioned prior. But the End Hostilities, going onwards, I would definitely suggest having these in the sideboard there and being able to get rid of like any of the board states that the company decks might create, or even just playing against like the Abzan blue decks or anything like that. Just being able to wipe out their board where you allow them to kind of like overcommit, especially if you're on the draw and they're on the play. They have a chance to kind of overpower you in terms of their plays as opposed to what you're able to react with. So if you tap out to like roast a creature or something like that and don't have mana to be able to counter it, they can play like a Siege Rhino, and then from there you have to play catch up in removal. So having that in Hostilities allows you to, maybe take a little bit more damage from a Siege Rhino, but it allows them to just commit a little bit more, maybe throw a creature or two onto the battlefield, and then you can end hostilities and get rid of stuff. So this is the deck that I would register going on from here, playing this same deck. I really enjoy this deck, and I think it has a huge amount of room, even though it's a more fringe deck in the meta, to actually have success and put up very, very good results. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I would greatly appreciate it if you leave some feedback for me down in the comments below. I know this is much more unorthodox compared to the deck techs and the videos that I'm used to creating. However, I think this is a much more effective means of talking about cards and going through theory with how I would actually approach things, and like the numbers of cards that we're playing with, and changes that I would make to the deck, especially because I can switch back and forth between decks as well. So any feedback would be appreciated down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you thumbs up the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Plenty more will be coming as usual. And again, thank you guys for joining me for this lengthy discussion about this deck and going through and talking about it. And until next time, peace out, guys.